Hello everyone, welcome to another anime review. It's been a hot minute since I did my last one, which I believe was Robotech a few months ago. And for the new subscribers who might be a little bit confused why I'm reviewing Ninja Scroll on this channel, it's because every now and again I like to do content that isn't necessarily 100% video game shmup related, just because I think it's healthy not to be too one-dimensional. Of course, in the analytic side of things, YouTube does not agree, but I feel like it's kind of like taking your vitamins, where even though it's not apparent that it's good for your channel, I do think overall, I think it's good to have a nice, healthy body of work and maybe not be just one thing all the time, especially when your one thing ends up kind of getting old and people want something new and interesting. At least spreading your wings earlier on, I think, can be helpful in the long run. But anyway, so I've decided to talk about Ninja Scroll not only because it is one of my favorite anime films, but because I haven't actually seen it in a really long time, and I rewatched it on Hulu a week or so ago and thought, okay, there's a lot going on in this film that kind of went over my head, or maybe I didn't quite think about in the same way when I watched it as a teenager. And so I think it's cool to kind of give an updated perspective of this film. I'm not an anime expert or historian or anything like that, so um, I don't know a whole lot about the background of Ninja Scroll. I do know it's kind of one of the earlier anime films that came to the West and is definitely, I think, more geared towards the Western market, not only in the art style, but kind of the chambura. I think that's what you call it, like the samurai swordplay. That always goes well in the West. Even Japanese films like Yojimbo and Shinjiro. Yes, I know a little bit about Kurosawa and all that, are pretty popular among Westerners and influence stuff like the good, bad, and the ugly and all that sort of thing. But what I really like about Ninja Scroll, having rewatched it, is I forgot just how lean and precise the storytelling of this show is. And of course, the incredible, incredible art and brutal animation. And so I want to begin this review in a little bit unconventional way. Maybe this will be a thing going forward, where I want to begin with my overall impression of the film and then sort of move through all of my different points and discussions and all those types of things. And so my overall impression of the film, having rewatched it again, is I think I appreciate it even more now. I think this is one of the best anime films that I've ever seen. Now, I think there's a certain amount of alignment of taste in that, where I could see some people viewing it and based on their own personal interests, thinking it's kind of, above average, but not that interesting. But for me, I think it is one of the best anime films that I've seen, and it hits a lot of the boxes that what I like to see in anime and stuff like that. And I do really wish more stuff was currently being made that was more like Ninja Scroll than kind of what we're seeing. And again, I'm not an anime expert. For all I know, there is some kind of badass Ninja Scroll esque stuff out there, but from what I am seeing, I don't think the '90s style of anime is coming back as much as I'd want to see. And it might be just a cost issue. I remember hearing about that sort of thing, where I'm sure this movie, you can tell by the quality of the animation, I'm sure it had a pretty hefty budget, and making its way to the West early on, I'm sure that was expensive as well. I do want to say that I watched this on Hulu and I watched it sub. And for those who maybe saw my previous anime reviews, I do kind of an interesting thing where usually I'll watch shows dubbed but with the subtitles on. That's mostly because I actually watch all TV with subtitles on because of being at a certain age, and also because I have difficulty hearing words in mixes of a lot of movies and it really irritates me. I mean, I can literally hear it, but I hate how a lot of films are mixed sound wise, where the dialogue is really buried in and they have like clacking of plates and all this kind of other BS noise going on. And so I do watch a lot of films on like lower volume with subtitles. But anyway, so the interesting thing is with a lot of anime, what happens is if you watched it dubbed, usually the subs don't line up exactly with the dub version. They line up actually with the subbed version because they're just, being lazy and putting the Japanese subs on there. So it gets some pretty interesting scenarios where you look at the Evangelion dub, the older one, not the Netflix one. I don't know about the Netflix one yet. But the older one, it's pretty close, between the spoken dub and the written sub. You can kind of see them lined up. But with some of them, like Roni Kenshin or Rurouni Kenshin, however you say it, my Japanese sucks, but the Kenshin, samurai shows, it's hilarious the inconsistency between the dub and the sub translation, where the sub translation usually has like much more poetic, stirring monologues in the subs, and then dubbed, it's just like a simple line. And I don't think it's a bad dubbing or anything like that. I just think the way the difference of language and expression is that it would sound kind of ridiculous, and I don't think they'd actually shove that much dialogue into the characters' mouths. So it is pretty interesting to see the. You can watch that on Netflix, I think, right? And you can just see the difference if you watch dubbed with subtitles on. Anyway, so I'm going into this huge tangent because I usually watch most anime if it has a decent dub with the dub on because I have no Japanese skills at all, and then I'll read the sub so I can kind of get the best of both worlds there. But for this one, I actually think just watched it subbed because the dub is solid, but it has that very distinctive 80s dub quality. And for a lot of films, or a lot of anime, I like that a lot. Like with Robotech, I like the dub, even though it's like this whole different beast, because I like the 80s aesthetic to that dub and the voice acting. I think 80s dubs are usually pretty solid. Well, the higher quality ones. But for Ninja Scroll, I think that 80s-esque dub or early 90s dub kind of hurts the film a little bit because it feels very contemporary still. It feels like this could have come out a few years ago. It doesn't feel dated other than the aspect ratio. So that's why I think watching it subbed, it kind of makes it feel a little bit more contemporary because you can definitely tell it's dated by the older dub. So, and I know a lot of people will agree with that anyway because they don't like anime dubs for the most part. The thing is that I am always very interested in the art of dubbing anyway. So I'm more into that than actually anime itself at some ways. So that's why I also tend to watch dubs, is just because I like to see how it turned out in the process and kind of listen for if the dub went well or not. But anyway, let's talk about Ninja Scroll now. So I went over, I think, the animation style. It's very hard to describe what the animation style is. I think it's related to Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. You all can correct me in the comments if that's incorrect, but I think there's some kind of studio association there. And you can tell it's kind of like that high detailed, almost gothic looking anime. And I love that style. I remember they did a Castlevania Netflix anime, not well, kind of like an anime crossover thing. That was pretty good. It was like going for the this sort of style, but it doesn't quite nail it in my opinion. So the first thing about Ninja Scroll is because it's a kind of Chambara style film, like Yojimbo and stuff like that. You can tell it's heavily influenced by Akira Kurosawa films, like heavily. It's pretty obvious, in a good way though. These types of films, same thing with like the good, bad, and the ugly, those types of things. These types of films don't rely on like dialogue and stuff as much as the visual aspect of the storytelling, and so that's another reason why Ninja Scroll works so well subbed, even if you're not a native speaker, is because you don't really need all that much dialogue to understand what's going on because the game or the I'm used to saying game because the anime is so visually driven story wise, and I like that a lot. There's a lot of like great screen grab ish moments, and I remember a friend of mine has the part where they kill the horse and there's like that severed horse head. He's been using that as his Steam avatar for forever, right? And we actually made kind of like a meme where we used dead horse heads or horse from anime in our Steam avatars. And so there's just a lot of moments like that in Ninja Scroll where you could just take a screen grab and like use it as like a background or in a YouTube thumbnail or something like that, which I'm sure I'll be doing just because of how stylized the art style is. Another thing that I really appreciate about this film that it didn't dawn on me the first time I watched it, because I'm gonna be honest, when I was a teenager and I first watched Ninja Scroll, I was like, okay, I'm looking for two things. I'm looking for nudity and violence, and it's definitely got those things, but the other elements of the anime kind of went, oh, I wasn't really as tuned into those as I am now. And I think the biggest thing that stands out to me about Ninja Scroll, sometimes to its detriment, but for the most part, is just how economical it is with its scenes and its storytelling, like the direction side of it. This anime is not, it almost doesn't feel like most other animes. I think a lot of animes you watch, especially like Kenshin, for example, there's a lot of sort of extra stuff and sort of ornamental stuff going on. Like, oh, let's have a shot of like trees for a few seconds and let's add in like cicadas and sunsets. You know what I mean? To kind of set that vibe, which is, nothing wrong with that. But that doesn't happen as much in this film. It's just very like, very precise, economical, and I don't think it's that long of an anime film either. Kind of reminds me a lot of Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, and that's probably another reason why I like it so much. Um, Very visual storytelling, and then it's just moving from scene to scene, and the storytelling is much more confined and contained than a lot of anime, especially anime is pretty like think about Dragon Ball Z or the Kenshin series and stuff like that, even Evangelion, where they have this really massive scope and massive storytelling and a lot of backstory and a lot of like supplemental elements to the story. But with Ninja Scroll, it's very focused in on the characters, the setting, the plot. You don't get a whole lot of backstory or world building and all that sort of stuff. And I actually like that a lot. It's because I like films that tend to just hone in on those main elements. I think TV shows work a little bit better when you get into that whole world building thing and stuff. Not that that's always the case, but that's one thing I also really noticed about the film. For example, when they have all those deadly assassins, right? And they're coming up and they're going to kill the main characters and stuff like that. I feel like in a lot of anime films, they would give like little backstories to these guys, and then when they show up to fight, they would give kind of almost like Metal Gear Solid, right? They'd give a sort of monologue of their motivations, and then they'd have like, and then after they get knifed, they'd have a flashback of their mother dying as a child. Like Kenshin does this a lot too. They give a whole lot of like surplus information about the characters, even the villains and stuff like that. Ninja Scroll is not like that. The dude just gets murdered next scene, like scene to scene to scene. And I think what the film is really good at doing is that could feel pretty abrupt or it could feel incomplete. But because the visual aspects of the film say a lot, you can kind of gather a lot just from that. Like the Shadow Claw guy, you can kind of gather a lot about him, or the bee dude. And I do wonder, I'll talk about the characters in a minute here, but basically the story lets you fill in a lot of those blanks without having to go on about it, because a lot of it is ultimately, not that important. I think a lot of anime could learn a lesson of this, where it's like a lot of the backstory we hear in anime and stuff is pretty unnecessary, and it kind of kind of slows down the pace of the shows and stuff like that. And I really like snappy, quick moving shows that aren't it's hard to explain, because sometimes you can get too abrupt, and people, especially these days, like the Disney Star Wars films are a good counter example to this, where think of the Rise of Skywalker. They're like very snappy and very abrupt, but it's not perfectly timed. It's not just the right amount of cuts. It's too fast. It's too abrupt. There's actually no backstory there. Whereas it feels like with a Ninja Scroll, it's all there, but it's just the way it's placed is very strategic, so you're not getting slowed down in the pacing and stuff like that. Anyway, so let's move on and start talking about the overall impressions of this film and the story that stood out to me. And of course, this is going to be very different depending on who you are and what you're kind of attracted to, or what you kind of notice when you're watching films. And I notice things that I think a lot of my fellow peers, because based on conversations I have with people, don't tend to think about as much, or maybe aren't as interested in looking at. And one that definitely stood out to me, especially since I'm very familiar with this sort of genre in live action, like Western Chambara type stuff, is there is a lot of machismo Ninja Scroll, and I think a lot of 90s anime had that sort of machismo edge, but there's always a little bit of sort of subversion of that as well, which is always refreshing. So, machismo, for those who might not be as familiar with that term because it is a bit of a technical term, it's kind of like male. It's hard to describe exactly, and it can be. Some people use it as like a negative, but it's basically like the ideal version of being male based or being like manly, like manly stuff, I guess, is stuff with like machismo, like Die Hard or something like that, where it's got that sort of masculine energy going on for it. And dudes, I mean, usually shows with a lot of machismo, dudes like, and your girlfriend wouldn't be into it. Like, and I'm pretty sure if I showed my woman a ninja scroll, she'd be like, "What the hell is going on with this?" Especially with certain scenes we'll talk about in a bit. But it has a lot of that going on for it if you're into that sort of thing. But it also has elements to it that sort of undercuts it. And at the end of the film, I sat and really thought about these elements of like the gender and the machismo and the sexuality, because I feel like it's uncommonly forward with those things, especially for anime. Like anime shows, even like the more racy ones or stuff like that, or the more like adult type ones, they're usually not as straightforward with sexuality as Ninja Scroll is. And I think it's kind of a breath of fresh air for the genre, because a lot of, again, I don't watch like recent stuff, so I could also just not be totally familiar with anime at this point. But when you think about even Ghost in the Shell or all these types of shows, they have a lot of sexual elements in the films, but they're always kind of in the background. Like that's a lot of how anime is, I've noticed. Same thing with Kenshin, right? There's a lot of sexual elements, but it's never quite right forefront. Where in this show, it definitely is. Like basically all the villains are it's like that's uncomfortable, but it also would make kind of make sense. Like, yeah, that's probably how it would be in this type of scenario, and this would be something that the lead female would have to confront in some way or another, or would probably be part of her backstory in some way. And that's a very uncomfortable subject, and I think that's something I want to talk about a little bit more when we get to the characters. But that element of the show really had me thinking a lot, actually, especially at the end after the lead girl. I have their names written down here, so I better look at that. But the lead woman dies. I sat like I for me that's kind of like the climax of the film, and then the part where he murders the main villain and stuff. That almost feels like uh not a climax. It feels like an epilogue. Like of course he was going to do that, but the climax is when the girl dies. And it to me, this would be interesting for people who've watched Ninja Scroll. To me, it feels like this story is more of a tragedy than like a typical I'm trying to think like Yojimbo, or that's kind of an obscure film, or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or Die Hard. One of those machismo type shows, right? Usually the machismo type show, the guy fights the main villain, gets the girl. Sometimes it doesn't work out, like in the Dirty Harry films. It never works out, and the film kind of hints that it works out. But he still saved the woman, and there's still like some sexual chemistry there, and for the most part, it's all good. But in this film, the lead female character, I'll have to get to her name here in a bit, dies tragically. And to me, it feels like, okay, that's the end of the show, because the whole show is really about their relationship. Like, that's a huge focus of the plot. I feel like all the other, like, machismo type elements aren't as pressing. I mean, of course, they're coming at them and trying to kill them, but that's, like I said, for instance, if this was more of like a Metal Gear type situation or a more typical anime, all of that stuff would be more the focus, right? Or like Dragon Ball Z or something like that. Like the villains, their plots, their desires, what they're up to, that would be the focus. And then like Bulma and Vegeta or something in Dragon Ball Z, that's kind of like backstory, or like Goku, or you know what I mean? the Kenshin films, they're a little bit more romance oriented, but that's still sort of in the background. But with this, it feels like their relationship is the main focus of the show. And then the enemies trying to murder them is sort of like the setting. And so I almost feel like, is Ninja Scroll kind of like a romance? It would be interesting. I think you could make the argument that it is a romance, just a romance with a lot of, I can't say that, a lot of and violence. But I almost feel like it kind of is, because when the lead girl dies, at least for me, and maybe this just might be my way of viewing the film. Like I said, when that girl dies, I'm like, okay, the show's over now. Um, the rest feels very pointless, right? And I don't know if that's by design or not. That's why I'm kind of divided on the film as far as if this stuff is intentional or if it's just I'm reading into it a certain way. But it's also very unusual. I haven't really seen a film quite like it, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the characters. Keep that in mind. So let's talk about the characters then. So I have tried to phonetically write out their Japanese names. Like I've said, I'm horrible with Japanese. I think Jubei is the lead character's name. That's how I'm trying to pronounce it. Um, what's interesting about this guy is at first he seems like the very stereotypical anime protagonist, especially from like the 90s. But I actually really like his character a lot because he reminds me a lot of Spike from Cowboy Bebop, someone like that, where he's outwardly very sort of brusque and disinterested and cool internet persona type guy, right? Who is like, oh, I don't care. I'm just in it for myself type thing. But he's also a pretty caring person, you can tell. Like he's doing things for those villagers, even though he doesn't have to, at basically no cost. And then he goes out of his way to protect the main girl in a lot of circumstances. And that feels more like his like part of his goal, and he's also forced into the plot by the old man character, to where he wasn't really acting in the plot a lot. He's basically focusing on trying to keep everyone alive, and that's a very I think that's a very cool way for his character to sort of interact in the plot. Where usually lead characters, they're on some kind of mission, and their mission is what's most important, and then the casualties along the way, something like Robotech, right? But in this one, he's really just trying to stay alive the whole time, and he's not really all that interested until he gets to that part where he finds out the dude that he chopped his head off, Genma, the main villain, until it gets to kind of a little bit more typical, okay, now I want to get revenge on Genma type stuff. But before that, how he gets roped into the story and roped into the plot, I really like. Which brings in the next character, which is Dakuan. I'm trying to pronounce it. I'm sure you all have fun in the comment section with my Japanese pronunciation. But so this character is pretty cool. He's the old man shapeshifter dude. Very Machiavellian, sort of manipulative guy. Basically forces the main character into the whole plot. And from what I understand, he's a government agent, and it's hard to kind of pin him down, right? Because there's parts where you think he's just a sadistic psycho that's manipulating Jubei the entire time. Then there's other points where you feel like he has some ethics down deep somewhere. And I think overall he's maybe a bit of an anti-hero type character. I liked him a lot. He's definitely the main force that's driving the plot forward most of the time, and he has that sort of Morpheus type omniscience for the audience. Like if you think about the Matrix without Morpheus, most of the film wouldn't make much sense or would feel very cryptic. But then you have that omniscient lead, sort of expository character who explains, this is who this guy is, this is who that is, this is what we're doing, this is why this is important. And that's the role this guy feels. He's like the Morpheus, a little bit the evil Morpheus, or somewhat evil Morpheus, of the film. And then there's Genma. So that's the main sort of villain. There's a bunch of different ones. I didn't bother to write down their names just because I also think they're more distinguishable by their descriptions than by their names. But Genma is the main lead villain guy, the guy that can regenerate after he gets his head chopped off, and it just melds back on. And He can't die apparently. Very interesting villain as far as his abilities. As far as an actual character, I think he's pretty generic, but what makes him kind of stand out from other anime villains is just the setting of the film and how brutal and sadistic this guy is. And kind of how, in a way, he almost feels like he won. That's how that when he kills the main girl. For him, that wasn't really all that important, but it kind of feels like this guy did damage, is what I'm getting at. Where a lot of anime and just film villains, you can think again like with Star Wars. Think of General whatever Commander Snoke or whatever the hell his name was. That guy literally did nothing the entire films. Never did any sort of real damage or anything like that. But with Genma, this guy murdered the main character or the main lead female character, and so yeah, that I think that's what makes him kind of stand out is he does actually achieve some shit in the film that's pretty terrifying, and it's satisfying when he dies, obviously, because I remember after it's like okay, this guy needs to die after he gets rid of her. And then there's the supporting cast of the various assassins. I think they're all pretty cool. It definitely reminds me of something like Metal Gear Solid. And I do wonder if Metal Gear Solid was inspired by um, Ninja Scroll in any way, or maybe they're drawing from a similar source. But you got the sexy snake girl that poisons people. You got the kind of elegant but deadly subordinate lead guy with the electric whip who's murdering. He mostly spends the film murdering his own comrades, actually, which is kind of funny. If you think about it, he doesn't. I think he does more damage to his own comrades than he does to the lead. So in a way, that's interesting. And then you got the dirty rock guy who has definitely the most memorable scene of the film in the beginning. I think we all know what that scene is, and I'll talk about that scene in a little while. But yeah, the rock guy, dude, genuinely terrifying. Probably to me the most unsettling of all the villains, and definitely the most satisfying when he dies. And then you got the Shadow Claw guy. This guy reminds me of someone out of Guilty Gear or something like that. Or he goes down in the very cool powers, and he kind of like the lead character, the lead female character as well. She's had a rough time, and he controls her through it. That's pretty messed up. The B guy reminds me so much of the Pain from Metal Gear Solid 3. I wonder if there was any sort of inspiration there, because not only does he seem similar with the power as the Pain, but they also seem to have kind of similar personalities. Kind of makes me wonder if Kojima drew inspiration from this film for that, or like I said, if that's just kind of like a common trope in anime that I'm not aware of. And then there's the blind swordsman. That's pretty common. You'll see him in a lot of shows. I feel like in Samurai Champloo there was some kind of blind dude they had to fight. Um, really cool fight though. Um, Very cool character overall. And like I said, I feel like in something like a Kenshin type film, or what do they call it, a shonen type show, that all these villains would kind of fit into a shonen, but then they would have their own little backstories, and they'd spend a lot of the film giving speeches and sort of playing around and doing all these weird things. But in Ninja Scroll, there's none of that. All of them come to kill, and they all feel a lot more deadly than normal kind of these types of film characters, which I really like. And then of course we got to get to the final character that I'm going to be discussing, who I think is the most interesting character of the film, which is Kagero, the ninja woman. Kagero. I really struggle with Japanese. Anyway, this character I think is the most fascinating because I don't really know what to make of her. I understand her as a character, but what kind of how she fits into the story, because there's a lot going on there. So let's begin. Of course, there's the famous R scene, we'll call it, because I'm trying really hard not to get demonetized. That's why you see blurred sort of footage beside me, is because I don't want to get demonetized, so I'm trying everything I can not to. But anyway, that scene I think is very, very famous for I think I even knew about that scene before watching the film for the first time, just hearing about it. Obviously, pretty disturbing, but like I said, the thing that's interesting about the scene is that it does. What's interesting is that in a lot of, I feel like in a lot of other shows or something like that, this character would basically be totally victimized and paralyzed into inaction, or you know what I mean? She would be kind of like a casualty. But in this film, the character is interesting because she has that trait to her where basically if you try to sexually assault her, I hope I don't get demonetized for saying that, um, you will die because her entire body is poisoned. And I feel like the show is kind of hinting at the reason for that is to prevent her from being sexually abused, or as a means of vengeance for those who try to do it, which I think's a really cool concept, to be honest. And so what's interesting is then you end up finding out that had that not happened to her, the rock guy probably would have killed the lead guy, Junbei, right? And so in a lot of ways too, she ends up saving the main character actually on more occasions than he saves her, which is interesting. So he saves her from the rock guy initially, but then she ends up kind of through her what happened to her, killing the rock dude and saving the lead character. And then it turns out that she is immune to poison, so she saves him from the snake woman who assumes that she won, but turns out, well, she's immune to the snakes. And then she also saves him from the bees because she has some kind of magic powers that keeps the bees at bay until he can end up killing the bee guy. And then she also saves him from the blind guy. And the throughout the film, it doesn't seem like her character is interesting because in one way you could think, oh, she's a naive fool, or she's naive and the main character is more savvy, and her arc throughout the story is going to be breaking that naiveness and like learning to be more self-sufficient and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like she's completely naive. It feels to me like, and I think it's hinted at through the dialogue, especially when they're in the forest and he says he doesn't like people who want to throw their lives away or something like that. It feels to me like this girl knows that she's going to die, and that the course she's going is basically a suicide mission, and she's aware of that, but she doesn't have anything to live for, or she's so traumatized or so lonely or so messed up that she would prefer to die. That's kind of how it comes across, and then basically ends up falling in love with the main character, Junbei, and then there's the whole there's a whole plot element where he gets poisoned by the old man, and then he finds out that the only way to cure it, or we assume the only way to cure it, is for him to have sex with her. And there's that scene where he goes to save her, and then she offers herself to him to save him. And also, I think because she's attracted to him, which she mentions, but when she's dying, and that seems really interesting because I think what the film is saying is that he refused, or I guess not refused is the correct word, but he declined having sex with her to sort of because to show his love for her, basically, because he knows that basically everyone in the film is trying to violate her, and so he shows her his love for her by not engaging in that. I'm guessing that's where it's going. Personally, I don't. I think if they hooked up, I don't. It could have worked as well. But I think it adds to the tragedy when she ends up dying at the end, because it's like, oh shit, they never had that. They never had that chance, and she actually never really got the full extent of knowing what love is and intimacy and all that kind of thing. So her death, it feels she's a very tragic character is what I'm getting at overall. And like I said, it almost feels like she's the main character of the movie rather than Junbei. It feels like the show's more about her than him, at least to me. And so with her death, I feel like that's kind of like the end of the show. It's like, okay, well, Junbei's going to go on and murder that guy and get revenge, but it all feels very bittersweet at the end. It feels very tragic. And so I want one thing I want to talk about with this character, and this will kind of be the ending of this review because I think this will largely inform your opinion of Ninja Scroll or not. As far as, of course, you'll a lot of people will like the film because it's got badass combat and it's got amazing animation and it's got a really tightly written story. But as far as like the heart of the film or the emotional connection of the film, I felt pretty moved by the film when she dies at the end. I felt like, damn, that hit. Where you look at a lot of other, I think this is a topic that's coming up a lot. When you look up at a lot of other female leads in films like Star Wars. I didn't see Mulan, but people are talking about this with Mulan, and I know my family wants to see it, so I probably will end up seeing it at some point. Most likely when it's not a pile of money. But with these kind of Disney lead characters, and I talked a little bit about this in my Star Wars review, is it feels like, okay, we're trying to create compelling female leads, but the thing about it is that when they're creating these female lead characters, it feels like to me they're afraid to damage them or to hurt them or to have them go through severe adversity. Can you imagine Rey in Star Wars getting Ard in the film and then having to like murder her killers or like getting revenge? Or I think that happens in Kill Bill, right? Which makes Kill Bill a really great female lead in my opinion, in Kill Bill, the bride. But yeah. So the main what I'm getting at in this main character is that she's got a lot going on to her, and based on your sort of perspective of how films should treat their female characters or not, I feel like she could be a very polarizing character where I could see some critics watching this film and saying she is just a sex object throughout the entire film. That's all she's about, and then she dies. She's thrown away at the end or whatever. But to me, it feels I really like this character a lot, where it feels like she's someone who is struggling against adversity the entire film and is coping with a lot. She's coping with a lot of trauma. She's coping with her trust issues, but she's also coping with her attraction and trying to understand what her feelings are or if that's, and then she says at the end that she regrets not sort of continuing those feelings and like being more vulnerable. That's some pretty forward thinking stuff, I feel like, for these types of films where the characters are talking about wishing to be more vulnerable with each other and not being more stoic and all that sort of thing. And so I do think, and then she dies tragically at the end, and she was killed because she believed in her clan. That's basically what happened. Where Junbei and Dakuman, the double agent or the agent type old man guy, their skepticism is what saves them, right? Because they don't fall for the trap. But she believes and she's has faith in her clan. And then it turns out that the dude's just shape shifting, and then she gets knifed horribly. So uh, the this character I think is very interesting, and I would like to hear what people think about her in the comments. Of do you feel like do you guys feel like she was a really well done character and someone that could be like this could be an interesting direction for kind of the state of what we're trying to figure out with, or what Hollywood's trying to figure out with female leads like Ray and stuff like that, where they're basically these idealistic portrayals of women, but at the same time, because they're so idealized and so void of any sort of characterization, they end up feeling really hollow. And then it feels like, are we doing these characters a service, or are we just giving them lip service, right? And I could feel what I'm saying is I could feel like this character could be looked at as sexist and could be looked at as poor representation of females in film and all those types of things, which is just a big talking point these days. And I would personally say I don't think she is. I think she's ultimately a tragic character, but at the same time, I remember her pretty. She's gonna stick in my memory for a long time. As far as holy, you know what I mean? She really sticks with you, and I think that's what makes the character really interesting. And I think overall, the goal of when you're writing these characters shouldn't be, well, does this reflect the reality I want to see? I think the more interesting thing is am I creating something compelling? Am I creating something that is connecting with the audience, that lends a real feeling of loss? And you could say, well, it's messed up because she's the female character and she's the one that dies. But at the same time, let's say Junbei died, it wouldn't hit as hard, right? Because he seemed like a character that was overall more content with life, and he's going to live by the sword and die by the sword, basically. Where this character, it feels much more tragic when she goes. So anyway, those are my overall thoughts on my sort of rambling review of Ninja Scroll. I hope you all enjoyed it. I left this one a little bit more open-ended than my usual reviews, so I'll be interested to hear what you all think. If rather than kind of presenting a thesis of what I thought about the film, I wanted to present more questions and have you all kind of think about it and hear what y'all think. So anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'll end by thanking my patrons. So thank you to Dingo, Andy Capt, Anthony A, Ben Win, Corio, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, House Sue, Kiwi, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malaise, Mark Toms, Martin Laurel, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugel, Smacky Factor, Sugumo, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.